Good evening. The princess who spent her life in the relentless glare of the public eye.
The Diana, Princess of Wales, has been killed in a car accident.
Diana, Princess of Wales, has in fact been killed in that car accident.
The world is in shock. Diana, Princess of Wales, is dead and Britain is in mourning.
It seems to me with someone, and the person they wanted to share their grief with was the Queen.
Very, very, very disgraceful, I find their behaviour. Very disgraceful.
I think it's disgusting that they have not appeared or said a word.
She was trying to balance what she had to do as a queen and what she had to do as a grandmother.
I think my mother did exactly the right thing. I think it's absolutely extraordinary.
That she had to respond to this extraordinary outpouring of grief about Princess Diana.
She was the people's princess, and that's how she will stay, how she will remain.
I really am upset.
I can't understand the Queen doing it, really.
No.
That any right-minded thinking parent should believe that it would have been an alternative.
And then she responded, and when she responded perfectly. She got the tone absolutely right.
There had been some tears in the crowd, but mostly the people seemed comforted by the presence once again.
She was an exceptional and gifted human being, in good times and bad.
She sounded very sincere, and she looked as though she was very moved, and I think that will satisfy everyone.
There are moments in royal history that define a reign, not for what was said, but for what wasn't. August 31st, 1997. The call came in the middle of the night. Princess Diana, the most photographed woman on the planet, was gone, and Queen Elizabeth II, 71 years old, at her summer retreat in the Scottish Highlands, was faced with the most unexpected crisis of her monarchy. What happened next would divide a nation, spark headlines that screamed betrayal, and leave a mark on the royal family that lasted for decades. Andrew Morton, the biographer who knew Diana's inner world better than almost anyone alive, has spoken extensively about what the Queen refused to do in the 5 days that followed. His account isn't just one perspective. It sits inside a larger, documented story of a monarchy that miscalculated badly at the worst possible time. If you want more deep dives like this, make sure to subscribe to Royal Archives. Because what the Queen refused to do wasn't just a personal choice. It was an institutional decision. And Britain never quite forgot it. When the news arrived at Balmoral, the royal family did something that made perfect sense to them, and almost no sense to anyone else. They stayed. The Queen gathered her grandsons, William and Harry, kept them close, and decided that Balmoral was exactly where the family needed to be. Private. Shielded. Away from the cameras and the grief that was already gathering outside the palace gates in London. In 1997, this response came from a woman shaped by decades of royal protocol. You did not perform grief. You did not put loss on display. You absorbed it. You protected the children. And you carried on. This was the Windsor way. Hardened by war, by abdication, by 100 private heartbreaks that never once touched the public gaze. But Diana had changed the rules. That was precisely what Andrew Morton understood, having spent years absorbing the full weight of her story directly from her own recorded words. Diana had built something the monarchy had never encountered before, a direct emotional bond with the public that bypassed the institution entirely. She didn't need the palace to speak for her. She spoke to the cameras. She touched people on hospital wards. She sat on the edge of a bed next to a man dying of AIDS and held his hand while the world watched. When she died, the grief that erupted across Britain wasn't just mourning, it was personal. Millions of people felt they had lost someone they knew, and the Queen was at Balmoral. Silent. 2 days passed, then 3. The flag above Buckingham Palace flew at full mast. Protocol dictated it. The flag only flew when the monarch was in residence and the Queen was not there. But the optics were catastrophic. The people arriving to leave flowers outside the palace gates looked up and saw a flag at full height as if nothing had happened. As if the palace didn't notice. As if Diana didn't warrant the acknowledgement. Andrew Morton's assessment of this period is grounded in his intimate knowledge of Diana's place in the public consciousness. a place the palace had consistently underestimated. Morton had watched the institution dismiss her, sideline her, and ultimately strip her of her HRH title after the divorce. He had seen how the palace failed to understand what Diana represented to ordinary people. And in the 5 days after her death, he saw that same institutional blindness play out in real time, at the worst possible moment. By September 2nd, the mood outside Buckingham Palace had shifted from grief to something harder. The flowers were piling up, thousands of bouquets pressed against the iron gates, but the messages tucked inside them were changing. "Where is our queen?" read one. "Your people are suffering. Speak to us." The tabloids, never far from the temperature of public feeling, ran headlines that were blunt enough to cut. The Express ran, "Show us you care," in letters large enough to read from across a newsroom floor. The Sun, which had not always been kind to Diana during her lifetime, asked directly, "Where is our queen?" And still the family stayed at Balmoral. What the Queen refused to do in those days was not simply return to London, though that was part of it. She refused, initially, to lower the flag. She refused to release a public statement. She refused to interrupt the routines of royal life in Scotland. The Sunday church service still went ahead, the family seen walking in the grounds, while below the border a nation had come undone. Each refusal, taken alone, had a protocol justification. Taken together, they read as indifference. This was the gap that Andrew Morton had spent years analyzing. The palace operated on one set of emotional logic. Diana had operated on another, and the British public by 1997 had chosen Diana's. There was a conversation happening inside Balmoral during those days, and by several accounts, it was not a calm one. The Queen's advisors were watching the coverage. Her press secretary was fielding calls from editors who were no longer asking questions. They were issuing warnings. The Prime Minister, newly elected and acutely sensitive to public mood, was among those urging the palace to respond. His team would later describe the phone calls to Balmoral as some of the most delicate of that entire period. The Queen's instinct was to protect William and Harry. That was genuine, and it mattered. The boys were 12 and 15. They had just lost their mother. Whatever the state of the Diana-Charles marriage, whatever the complexity of the Queen's own relationship with her former daughter-in-law, these were her grandsons in shock. Every decision she made in those first days was filtered through that lens. Keep them away from the cameras, keep them away from the crowds, give them time. But the country didn't know that, and the palace didn't tell them. That was the second refusal, and in some ways the more revealing one. The institution had the ability to explain itself. A simple statement, early and clearly worded, might have shifted everything. Her Majesty is with her grandsons, supporting them through this devastating loss. 7 words of context could have reframed 5 days of silence. But the palace hesitated, then delayed, then hesitated again, bound by a culture that had never believed it owed the public an explanation. Andrew Morton has been direct about what this revealed. Diana's story, from the beginning, was partly the story of an institution that refused to adapt. The same qualities that made the palace resistant to her in life, the deference to protocol over emotion, the preference for silence over transparency, made it resistant to the moment of her death. By September 4th, the pressure had become impossible to contain. The Queen's press secretary made a televised statement, acknowledging the family's grief and insisting the priority was William and Harry. It helped? Slightly. Charles's younger brothers were dispatched to walk past the crowds gathered outside Balmoral, a gesture of visibility, of acknowledgement. That evening, the Queen and Prince Philip walked out to see the flowers at the gates. William and Harry came too. Cameras caught the image. It was a turn. But the question the public was asking, the one Morton would later frame clearly, was why it had taken 4 days to get there. On September 5th, the family returned to London. The flag question, which had taken on a symbolic weight far beyond its literal meaning, was resolved. A Union Jack was raised at half-mast above Buckingham Palace, the first time in history the flag had flown that way outside the palace. That single image, captured and broadcast everywhere, was understood as what it was, a concession. The Queen had moved. That evening, she addressed the nation. She spoke from Buckingham Palace, live on television, and what she said was carefully measured, and by the standards of a woman who had never publicly aired private emotion, remarkably personal. She called Diana an exceptional and gifted human being. She spoke of Diana's devotion to her 2 boys. She said she admired her. She said she respected her. And then she said something that landed harder than almost anything else in the speech. Because it acknowledged, without quite admitting, what the preceding days had cost her. This week at Balmoral, she said, we have all been trying to help William and Harry come to terms with the devastating loss that they and the rest of us have suffered.
We have all been trying to help William and Harry come to terms with the devastating loss that they and the rest of us have suffered.
It was the word trying that stayed with people. Not succeeding. Trying. The speech worked in the way that it needed to. The fever of anger that had gathered outside the palace broke. When Diana's coffin passed the next day and the Queen bowed her head in a long, deliberate bow, not a nod, it was understood as something genuine. The woman accustomed to being bowed to was, for a moment, doing the bowing. Britain noticed. But Andrew Morton's point, and the point that has stayed in the historical record, is that the 5 days before the speech told a different story. The speech was what the institution was capable of, when finally pressed to the edge of what it could survive. The 5 days before it were what the institution was in its natural state, silent, sheltered, operating on logic that belonged to a different era. Morton's knowledge of Diana made him uniquely placed to see what that cost. Diana had spent the last years of her life trying to make the palace understand that the world had changed, that the compact between the monarchy and the public ran through emotional honesty now, not just ceremonial presence. She had said this in tapes. She had said it in interviews. She had said it in the Panorama interview of 1995, which shook the institution to its foundations and left the Queen reportedly furious. She died before she saw any evidence the palace had heard her, and in the 5 days after her death, the evidence suggested it still hadn't. The longer consequence of those 5 days is harder to measure but impossible to dismiss. Prince William has spoken, in the years since, about walking behind his mother's coffin as a 15-year-old, about the way the crowds on the street seemed to reach toward him and Harry, and how strange and enormous that felt. He has spoken about the grief he carried silently for years, and about the institutional habit of suppression that he eventually had to break his way out of. The events of 1997 are visible in the architecture of what came after. Harry's eventual decision to speak publicly, to name what the institution had done to his family, and to use the language of emotional damage and institutional indifference, runs directly through the 5 days after Diana died. Whether you believe Harry's account or not, the pattern he described had its clearest precedent right there, at Balmoral, in the summer of 1997. Andrew Morton watched the palace misread Diana in life. He then watched it misread the moment of her death. His conclusion, careful, backed by years of proximity to these events, is that the institution's refusal to adapt wasn't cruelty. It wasn't indifference. It was something more structural than either. It was a monarchy that had built its survival on emotional containment and could not in 5 days unlearn 70 years. The Queen's speech worked. The bow worked, the flag worked, but the 5 days before them told the truth. And that truth? What was refused, what was withheld, what the palace could not bring itself to do until the country forced its hand, is the part that Andrew Morton has never let the historical record forget. What does it mean for a monarchy to survive a moment like that? The Queen went on to reign for 25 more years, her standing recovered. She found her way slowly to the kind of warmth Diana had always argued was possible, but the question Morton keeps asking is not whether the monarchy survived. It did. The harder question is what it cost to remain exactly as it was, in the 5 days when the country needed something else. The flowers outside Buckingham Palace were 7 feet deep by the time the family came home. That detail has never really left. There is one more detail that sits underneath all of it, easy to overlook, hard to dismiss once you've seen it, While the nation argued over flags and silences, William and Harry were at Balmoral attending Sunday church. The image of those two boys, 15 and 12, walking to the local church the morning after their mother died, is one Morton has referenced when discussing what the Queen genuinely believed she was doing right. She was giving them normalcy, routine, structure, the things that had steadied her through every crisis of her own life. She was not wrong exactly. She was just applying a blueprint the boys hadn't been built from. Diana had raised them differently. She had taken them to homeless shelters and AIDS wards and McDonald's. She had told them she loved them in public. She had cried in front of them. She had built emotional vocabulary into them that the Windsor template had never included. And so when the Queen offered the Balmoral routine, the walks, the church, the containment, what William and Harry received was not what she intended to give. This is what Morton's perspective makes visible in a way few others can. He knew Diana's parenting philosophy. He had heard her describe, in her own recorded words, how deliberately she had raised her sons to feel things openly. The 5 days at Balmoral weren't just a public relations failure. They were a collision between two completely different ideas of what a grieving child needs. The Queen thought she was protecting them. What Diana would have known, instinctively, was something the palace had spent a century learning not to give. That gap between intention and impact, between the institution's self-understanding and the reality of what it delivered, runs through Andrew Morton's entire body of work on the royals. He documented it in Diana's lifetime. And the 5 days after August 31st, 1997, remain its clearest expression. The monarchy endured. The Queen adapted, eventually, on her own terms. But Morton's question remains, whether it ever fully understood what those 5 days revealed. Subscribe to Royal Archives for more deep dives into the moments that shaped the monarchy, the private conversations, the institutional decisions, and the stories that the official record doesn't always tell in full.